The liturgical movement of the 20th century, which ultimately gives us the Novus Ordo, was highly inspired by the secular Enlightenment of the 18th century. But it wasn't the first Catholic offshoot group to be inspired by the Enlightenment. In fact, the Gallican movement in France and the Jansenist movement, which was closely allied with it, developed many of their thoughts, including their thoughts about the liturgy, in close collaboration with the Enlightenment. So, was the liturgy of the Gallican/Jansenists of the 18th and 19th centuries a sort of old Novus Ordo, which paved the way for the eventual Novus Ordo of 1969? This is an idea that's floating around in traditional circles. It seems to be implied by Alcuin Reid in his great The Organic Development of the Liturgy. We're going to take a look at the rise of Gallicanism and Jansenism, as well as nationalistic Catholicism in general, which was the great scourge of the 17th and 18th century Catholic Church. So I'm excited to begin this very interesting dive into Gallicanism and Jansenism, and whether or not their Enlightenment-inspired liturgical beliefs were a prototypical Novus Ordo Mass. So, let's get started. Dom Prosper Granger was the hammer to the Gallican and the Jansenist movement, and he defeated these great heresies not so much through theological arguments, but through his great devotion to the traditional liturgy of the Catholic Church. Let's pray with him in this prayer that's adapted from his prayer to St. Benedict for the restoration of Western civilization through a love of the sacred liturgy. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. O Benedict, thou vessel of election, thou palm of the wilderness, thou angel of the earth, we offer thee the salutation of our love. The Savior has crowned thee as one of his principal cooperators in the work of salvation and the sanctification of men. O Father of so many people, look down upon thine inheritance, and once more bless this ungrateful Western civilization, which owes everything to thee, yet has almost forgotten thy name. By thy prayers keep it from perishing, give firmness to what has been shaken. May a new West, a Catholic West, spring up in place of that which heresy and false doctrines have formed. O Patriarch of the servants of God, look down from heaven on the vineyard which thy hand hath planted. Raise it up again, multiply it, sanctify it. Let the Spirit which thou hast deposited in thy holy rule flourish in its midst, and show by thus blessing it that thou art ever Benedict, the servant of God. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I'm very grateful for all of your support, and I'm even more grateful for your love of church history. Please continue to spread the love of church history by sharing the video, liking, and commenting. I would love to engage with you below in a discussion about what you see here. Also, consider joining our community of scholars, the Scholarium, in which we seek to be what the university was always meant to be, a group of people studying truth, guided by the light of sacred tradition. Let's get started. In post-conciliar progressive, as well as even in conservative or center-right Catholic literature, Jansenism is often oversimplified as a heresy that was simply overly rigorous. In other words, a heresy that believed in the Catholic moral laws too much and was too strict about them, which would not be a heresy. Or a heresy that either overemphasized the gravity of sin, which can't be overemphasized, or de-emphasized God's mercy, which perhaps they did do that. The remedy, it is often said in these oversimplifications of the crisis of Jansenism, was Saint Therese of Lisieux's simple way to God, through the little way, and Saint Faustina's great emphasis on God's mercy in the apparitions that she received. Now, both Saint Therese of Lisieux and Saint Faustina did have very important messages for the universal church. However, they weren't directly an antidote to Jansenism, because Jansenism was not merely a heresy of, let's say, fuddy-duddies. In reality, there was not actually an 18th or 19th century heresy which proclaims that God is merciful but not that merciful, or sin is really bad and it's worse than it actually is. Okay, so that was not the error with Jansenism. Jansenism was rather a soteriological heresy that erred in its theology of salvation. That's what soteriology means. It inflated the measured Catholic idea of predestination to make it a universal law which determined every soul's salvation. So St. Augustine first proposes the concept of predestination. He taught that it is possible, it's theologically possible, that God could provide such a degree of grace to a soul that they would most certainly freely choose to cooperate with that grace and therefore would be predestined for heaven. St. Augustine said only God's wisdom knows when and how it is appropriate to predestine someone for heaven. St. Augustine did not believe that all the saved souls were predestined for heaven, but this was a special privilege for some souls that only God would understand. So according to the Catholic tradition, that is a theological possibility. However, Jansenism erred in teaching that all the souls in heaven were predestined to go there, and all the souls in hell, therefore, were, by the negation of being predestined to go to heaven, were predestined to go to hell. There is no room for free choice, because according to Jansenism, the will is incapable of choosing anything that is truly good without the help of grace. And therefore, the souls that do not choose good, and therefore end up damned, are there because they weren't provided with grace, which implies that God chose to send those souls to hell. If you're familiar with Protestant theology, this is in fact Calvinism. Jansenism was accused in the 17th century as being essentially Calvinistic in its theology. However, unlike Calvinism, Jansenism was Catholic in its sacramental and liturgical systems. At the same time as Jansenism was spreading throughout France and the Low Countries, and even in some instances into Spain and Germany, so too did nationalist theories of ecclesiology, like the one we see in early Anglicanism in England, which believes that the Church of England was subjected to the King of England. These ecclesiologies were propagated by the absolutist monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries as well. Ultimately, because Jansenism was a heresy that was native to France, it would end up kind of merging unofficially with French Gallicanism. The two movements would become united. Gallicanism was primarily interested in making the bishops of France subjected immediately to the King of France rather than to the Pope. However, many Gallican bishops would accept elements of Jansenism or all of Jansenism because it was recognized as a native French heresy, or a native French theological system. They wouldn't call it a heresy. And by supporting Jansenism, it was a way to kind of stick it to the Pope. You know, oh, Pope, you think this is a heresy? Well, we're going to do it because this is our way of doing Christianity. So both the Gallican and the Jansenist movements would kind of ally themselves with one another. And this combined French Gallican-Jansenist movement would end up exchanging ideas quite freely with the secular theories of the Enlightenment when this dominated academia in France throughout the 18th century. In the organic development of the liturgy, Alcuin Reid seems to imply that the liturgy of the Gallicans, which sought nothing more than to make man better in his own opinion, could be compared to the eventual Novus Ordo Missal. In this video, we will examine this question. Was the Gallican-Jansenist/Enlightenment liturgy, especially as it was articulated and condemned in the Synod of Pistoia, a sort of old Novus Ordo liturgy? To be sure, there were certainly commonalities between the two usages of the Mass, and even more so between the attitudes of the reformers of the Novus Ordo and the Jansenists/Gallicans. However, were these similarities merely incidental because both movements did have some sort of relationship with the overly rationalistic and anti-traditional dispositions of the Enlightenment? Were these similarities then mere coincidences because of their common affinity for the Enlightenment? Or was the Jansenist liturgy, in fact, a precursor to the Novus Ordo? And if it was, does that mean that the condemnations of the Gallican-Jansenist liturgy should apply later towards the Novus Ordo liturgy? That is what we'll be looking at in this question. Once again, this whole series is based off of my text, The Missal of St. Paul VI, The Complete History of the Novus Ordo Mass. I also have other videos you can read if you want to study more. These are the first 3 videos of this series if you do want to check those out. Also, a lot of this book is inspired by Sean Blanchard's The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, and, of course, Alcuin Reid's The Organic Development of Liturgy. This is an overview of what we'll be covering in this video. We're going to begin with Jansenism, the origin of the absolutist monarchies of the early modern period. We will look at the similarities between the ecclesiologies of Anglicanism, Gallicanism, Febronianism, which is basically the Gallican variant in the German states, and the nationalistic Catholic ecclesiology in general. We will look at the merger of Gallicanism, Jansenism, and the Enlightenment. We will then examine the Synod of Pistoia and its vision for the liturgy. We will then look at the condemnation of Pistoia by Pope Pius VI. And finally, we will answer the question, was there an old Novus Ordo in the 18th century which was formulated by Jansenist heretics, or were the similarities between the Gallican-Jansenist liturgy and the Novus Ordo merely incidental? I've created this graphic here to kind of be a summary of everything we're going to be talking about. So let's begin with the traditional Catholicism here, which is the religious institutions of the Catholic Church, present throughout all of Christendom, and indeed all of the known world by the beginning of the 17th century. So we end up having this movement in academia or in philosophy towards the Enlightenment, which could be defined as radical doubt in received traditions, justified by materialistic empiricist natural sciences. But more than just being justified by science, the Enlightenment is mostly justified by materialist historiography or materialist other social sciences, which pretended to be empiricist, but were in fact mostly speculative. So there were these historical theories, or political theories, or psychological theories, which were materialistic, and they speculated on how we could replace our previous assumptions of a God being present in history, being present in the human soul, in psychology, and being present in how we should order societies in political theories. So the Enlightenment philosophy ends up having a huge influence over statecraft. It kind of influences absolutist monarchies, and absolutist political theories also influence the Enlightenment. These would lead to nationalized Catholicism, which is a major theme we'll talk about in this video. As we talked about, Jansenism was more of a hybrid between Calvinist Protestant theology and Catholic sacramental theology. But Jansenism would end up collaborating quite a bit with Enlightenment thought, because both were opposed to traditional Catholicism. And of course, an enemy of my enemy is my friend. We're also going to experience the rise of modernism throughout the 19th century, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. Modernism sought to integrate Enlightenment thought with Catholic theology, with Catholic liturgical studies, with scriptural studies, and modernist Catholics would ignore papal condemnations of certain strains of thought because they believed that basically the currents of mainstream academia, which by the 19th century was entirely built upon the premises of the Enlightenment, was more trustworthy than Catholic tradition. And so modernist Catholic thinkers believed it was their responsibility to try to allow Catholicism to be updated by the atheistic methods and the atheistic premises of the Enlightenment. The magisterium stood as a sort of brick wall between all of these movements and traditional Catholicism, and because the magisterium condemned all of these movements, one could only remain in the good graces of the Church and be obedient to the magisterium by simply rejecting all these movements off to the right. And then we come to today, so I'm zooming forward here, this is what we'll finish the video talking about. Today there is a window in this brick wall. And famously, Pope John XXIII is often misquoted, in my opinion, by saying that the purpose of Vatican II was to open up the windows of the Church and let in some fresh air. So it's a misquote. It does kind of capture the ethos of the Second Vatican Council, and there was an attempt to update the Church for sure. So this kind of describes that there's no written source where Pope John XXIII said this. There's no reliable source where he said this either. Regardless, it is a good metaphor for what Vatican II was. Ever since Vatican II, the post-Vatican II conciliar, that is, magisterium, has sought to be overseers of the opened window of this wall rather than maintainers of the brickwork. Since Vatican II, conservative Catholics have attempted to carefully permit particular Enlightenment-inspired ideas into the boundaries of Catholic orthodoxy. The following three movements are still outside of Catholic orthodoxy. The academic establishment, first and foremost, is still inspired by the Enlightenment. The academic establishment is still built upon radical doubt in received tradition, and it just keeps going and going and going. The purpose of being an intellectual in many secular universities is to think of some other assumption that society has and convince people to doubt it. And that's why today you see rampant doubt in even very basic biological realities, such as sex. Once again, the radical doubt of the academic establishment still to this day, following the tradition of the Enlightenment, justifies this doubt with materialistic, empiricist natural sciences, but more than that, it's justified with materialist social sciences, which pretend to be empiricist, but in reality are very speculative. Now, other movements that kind of have emerged and kind of continue the traditions of the 17th century movements, Jansenism may not be an element of the modern day church today. There isn't really an attempt to splice together Calvinist theology and Catholic sacraments, though there is certain individuals in the church who would like to Protestantize the church. Nationalized Catholicism, such as Gallicanism or the early Anglicanism or Febronianism in Germany, or Regalism in Spain, or Pistoiaism, if you will, in Italy. Today, that's the radical interpretations of the synodal way, especially as the German bishops have articulated their understanding of synodality. So, the German synodal way believes that the National Bishops' Conference of a particular nation has the authority to override the doctrines and moral teachings of the Pope. So this has evolved from the 17th century nationalist Catholic theories in which the king was in charge of the church within his nation. But regardless, it still believes that that there's more autonomy from the Pope. The Pope does not actually hold universal jurisdiction over the entire church. Further, modernism has evolved into progressive Catholicism. Movements such as the liturgical movement, the biblical movement, the Nueva Theologica, and the ecumenical movement. If you were to take all the beliefs advanced by these movements, they do stand outside of Catholic orthodoxy. Now, with that said, conservative Catholics have had a tendency to find what they can nod their head to in each of these movements. And so you may hear the liturgical movement described as simply being a movement in which liturgists hoped to make the liturgy more available to the lay people for their comprehension, and all those things are good. The laity should understand the liturgy and participate in it more actively, fully, with all their hearts. So a lot of times conservative Catholics will nod to the liturgical movement for that, but at the same time, in reality, there were liturgical movement scholars who denied liturgical dogmas from the Council of Trent, and so that is outside of Catholic orthodoxy. There may be particular participants in any one of these movements who were Orthodox Catholics, but there were definitely heretical members of these movements as well. Biblical movement basically calls for a return to the quote-unquote original texts, namely the Masoretic tradition, which is not an original text. It's an 8th or 9th century Jewish revision of the Hebrew Old Testament. So the biblical movement highly emphasized doing that, and that was largely adopted. The New American Bible and most English Bibles do use the Masoretic Old Testament rather than the Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate, so they got that approved. But there are other elements of the biblical movement, such as the historical critical method, which raise lots and lots of question marks. The historical critical method reads the Bible as though it were simply a historical text, and it analyzes it critically, basically finding things that it does not think actually happened in real life. It's definitely a heretical way to read the Holy Scriptures. The ecumenical movement, while it's good to try to get along with people, the ecumenical movement often dives into indifferentism, or the belief that all roads lead to God, or there are many paths to salvation, and Catholicism's only the privileged path to salvation. This is a heretical idea as well. Jesus is the only way to salvation, and there's no salvation outside of the church. That is a dogma of the faith going back to the 3rd century. So today, Catholic Orthodoxy is still the same religion as it was in the 16th century. However, there is a wider acceptable range of acceptable Catholic beliefs. Traditionalist Catholics are Orthodox Catholics today, and traditionalists continue to express reservations toward any ideas or reforms which have entered through the opened window of Vatican II from groups which, in their totality, are outside of the boundaries of Orthodoxy. Conservative Catholics have a more reconciliatory attitude towards these movements which are outside of the boundaries of Catholic orthodoxy. Pope Benedict XVI absolutely loved to engage with modern secular academia, and the Jesus of Nazareth books that he wrote can be seen as an attempt to engage with atheistic academia. Conservative Catholics do tend to appreciate elements of the Enlightenment and elements of the movements here, which could be described as the progressive Catholic movement. And conservative Catholics, if you will consider perhaps Pope Leo XIV as a conservative, he kind of is a center-right Catholic, most would say. He's nodding his head to a lot of the synodality that the German synodal way is advocating for, but I'm sure he, as well as Pope Francis, do not like the totality of what the German synodal way advocates for. Progressive Catholics tend to emphasize conformity to the post-Enlightenment academic establishment over conformity to the Catholic tradition, and that is what makes progressive Catholics outside of the boundaries of orthodoxy, because when push comes to shove, if they have to decide between what the professor says at the public university and what the Catholic tradition says, progressive Catholics, by definition, will side with academia. They will side with the Enlightenment and atheistic secular academic establishment over traditional Catholicism. So that is simply not orthodox. That's not within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. But like I said, these people still exist in this relationship with the Church because of the opened window of Vatican II. All right, so that's a long summary, as I am prone to give. Let's get started with the narrative here. How does Jansenism begin? This is Cornelius Jansen himself on the right. The story begins with the academic career of Michael Baius, or Michael de Bay, who taught in Holland in the middle of the 16th century and actually served as a theologian during the Council of Trent. Although his views were viewed with suspicion by most of the Council Fathers, he was an official theologian of the Spanish Emperor, and so he was given certain privileges, and he was not outright condemned by the Church Fathers. He wasn't explicitly condemned by the Council Fathers of Trent because of his political connections. I'll call him de Bay because he does tend towards heterodoxy, so I won't use his Latinization of his name, Baius. De Bay advocated for a return to the Church Fathers, or a resourcement, which would also be highly emphasized by the Nueva Teologica theologians of the 20th century. He held soteriological views that were, for the most part, identical to those of John Calvin as well, and Calvin's reading of St. Augustine. He was a leader of the 16th century anti-scholastic movement, which believed that we should sidestep over the entire scholastic movement, saying, okay, well, that's one interpretation of the Catholic tradition, let's go beyond it back to the Church Fathers. It's not exactly a correct interpretation of scholasticism. Scholasticism is not one take on the Catholic tradition, it is the received tradition. It is the corpus of medieval Catholic philosophy that's described as scholasticism. Was carefully developed as a way to use deductive reasoning to start with initial premises which are widely accepted and build upon them to reach conclusions which are based highly in logic as well as church tradition found in both the oral tradition and in sacred scripture. So scholasticism simply is the Catholic tradition. You could want to build onto it, but to simply ignore the scholastic tradition is very suspect of heresy. He was also critical of the doctrine of papal infallibility. He gained favor with the King of Spain, as I mentioned, which led to an initial leniency toward his suspicious positions. Ultimately, however, St. Pius V, of happy memory, condemned 79 of his propositions in a papal bull titled Ex Omnibus Afflictionibus. However, these propositions were condemned, but de Bay himself was not condemned by name. De Bay submitted to the Holy Father's judgment, and he was thus able to retain his professorship. But concern remains that he was actually continuing to teach these errors in secret to his students. This led to his propositions, however, not himself, being further condemned in 1579 by Pope Gregory XIII. Now, 6 years later, Cornelius Jansen was born in Holland. He pursued an academic clerical career at the University of Leuven in 1602. Then he went on to continue his studies in Paris, and he made a close friend, the French Jean d'Hervégier de Hauran. Both of them became attracted to the teachings of Michael de Bay, whose interpretation, once again, of St. Augustine's understanding of predestination led them to reach the same conclusions that John Calvin had reached, that we are incapable of choosing any good, without grace, and therefore those who choose evil are only choosing evil because God has deprived them of grace, because no one has any ability to freely cooperate with grace in and of themselves, but they can only do so if grace is allowing them to do so. This is the anthropologic theory of total depravity, that the soul is utterly corrupted and utterly incapable of choosing good without God's supernatural help. Once again, these beliefs of Michael de Bay, and now of Cornelius Jansen, as well as his companion, John de Vergier, were identical to those of the heresiarch John Calvin. Both of these young theologians believed that de Bay's teachings were not heretical, and they could, in fact, according to them, reawaken the Church's love of theology, which they believed had been too bogged down by the challenging jargon and obscure squabbles of late Renaissance scholasticism. In 1611, Jansen and de Vergier moved to Bayonne. This was de Vergier's hometown. There, Jansen was placed in charge of the Episcopal College, or the College of the Bishop. For the next several years, these two friends devoted themselves to the study of the Church Fathers, or a ressourcement, studying the Fathers rather than the scholastic theologians. Once again, this was also the stated goal of the progressive Nouvelle Theologica movement of the 20th century. From 1617 to his death in 1638, Jansen continued to study St. Augustine's teachings, especially his teachings regarding the primacy of grace. Now, Catholic tradition does, in fact, emphasize the importance of grace in our salvation, to the point where it's even appropriate to say that we are saved by grace alone, sola gratia, because only God's grace can infuse his divine life within us, which is the definition of entering into eternal life in heaven. So, to enter into eternal life in heaven, you must possess sanctifying grace in your soul, or a share in God's own life. And you could, through natural means, although this would be extraordinarily challenging with concupiscence, without supernatural help, it's theoretically possible for someone to live a just life with their own free will, because our wills are not totally corrupted, even though they are extremely damaged. It's very unlikely that someone would live a just life without God's grace, but it is possible. But even if you lived a just life, that would not mean you enter into heaven, because grace is a free, unmerited gift. The gift to share God's life within you, or have the Trinity dwelling within your soul, you cannot earn that. You cannot, in other words, be so good that God would be forced to give you grace. It would be like saying, I'm such a good man, I can force this woman to marry me. Although God is not like the woman in the relationship, but the point is, you can't force someone to share their life with you. That has to be a free, unmerited, or it has to be a free gift. And so God sharing his life with us is in fact pure grace. So you can't be saved or go to heaven without grace. But at the same time, Jansen, de Bay, and Calvin were each wrong in suggesting that the human soul is capable of no naturally good action without the supernatural assistance of grace. Concupiscence has left the soul deformed and inclined toward evil, but not utterly depraved or incapable of perceiving good, desiring good, or pursuing good. St. Augustine argued for the importance of man's free will to choose the good and to cooperate with divine grace in his works against the deterministic Manichaeans. So St. Augustine believed that man not only could choose the good, but had to choose the good in order to cooperate with grace. Indeed, he wrote in De Libero Arbitrio, we could not act rightly except by this free choice of will, and do not be troubled by the blame accorded to sinful souls, and do not say in your heart it would have been better had they never existed. They are blamed in comparison with themselves, when it is realized what they would be if they had not chosen to sin. He also said, even the vice by which the force of habit and long continuance has become a second nature had its origin in the will. So he does not believe the will is totally depraved, but he believes that our will is in fact free, and we are able to choose good, and we ought to choose good. In the City of God, he wrote, but it does not follow that though there is for God a certain order of all causes, there must therefore be nothing depending on the free exercise of our own wills. For our wills themselves are included in the order of causes which is certain to God, and is embraced by his foreknowledge, for human wills are also causes of human actions. He wrote that an evil will is caused by nothing, and this gets to what he means when these theologians misinterpret Augustine to say that we cannot choose good without God's grace. This is exactly what St. Augustine actually meant. So he wrote that the evil will is caused by nothing, or there is no efficient cause of evil, because the evil will is, in fact, a will which lacks goodness, or lacks the goodness of God, the source of all goodness. However, St. Augustine's understanding of grace is not as a sort of injection that God injects or infuses into the soul. It's more expansive than that. So rather than understanding the presence of grace in the soul as a sort of medicinal infusion, St. Augustine understood the relationship between the free human will and God's grace as the will's willful participation in actual being, which would expose them to the grace which was always present. St. Augustine says, the nature of God can never, nowhere, nowise be defective. In other words, St. Augustine believed the grace of God was always available to all people, but not all wills chose to engage with the actual being of God's grace, which is always present, since he is the source of all being. So when the will chooses not to be that which it's supposed to be, the will becomes evil, because evil is choosing to shirk your actual being or your actual identity. It is then the individual's choice to participate in being what it truly is, or choosing to participate in the grace God has available when one chooses to be what they were created to be. Thus, efficient causes for good or non-being. And thus, those that choose non-being rather than the good reject the ever-present grace and descend into evil. So that is against Jansenists. That's kind of the understanding of why Jansen was wrong, why Calvin was wrong, why Debay was wrong. However, Jansenism continued to spread after his death. After his death, Jansen's students and friends published his magnum opus, the Augustinus, in 1640. Now, those who sought a liturgically Catholic, yet anthropologically and soteriologically Calvinistic system of Christianity turned to the Augustinus as their central document. And to us today, the idea that God predestined some souls for heaven and some souls for hell, and there's really nothing you can do about it, that doesn't seem like a very attractive theology. It seems rather cruel, but it's been said in the study of the spread of Calvinism in the Anglican Church that this was a very attractive theology for people in the late medieval period / the early modern period. Because of the rampant anxiety about one's own salvation, it kind of put people to rest just to think, okay, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, it's just kind of up to God. So Calvinism was very psychologically attractive to people during this time. So Jansenism allowed people to try to form a sort of hybrid between Catholic sacraments, which many people were attached to and had a devotion to, but the kind of Calvinist peace of mind of not needing to worry about your salvation because, God had it all figured out for you. Now, among the errors, but eventually, even Calvinism would lead people to intense anxiety because they would try to be reading the signs to figure out if they were a part of the elect or if they were part of the predestined to be damned. It's said that at the end of St. Elizabeth's life, not St. Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth of England, who advanced Calvinistic Anglicanism in that nation, she was racked with anxiety because she had somehow convinced herself that she was a part of the damned. Well, hopefully not, but she did execute 300 good, faithful Catholic priests and lay people. So, anyways, she probably was walking in that direction, but hopefully God somehow saved her. But it wasn't because she was predestined for hell; it was because of her free choices. Among the errors of the Augustinus, you can read these here. It's a summary of the condemnation of Jansenism, which you can read here if you'd like. Basically, Jesuit theologians such as, I've already kind of gone over his errors, Jesuit theologians such as Father Ferron and other Jansenists identified Jansen's thought as identical to the thought of Calvin. So this is not just me saying they are similar, this was the idea back then, and this is the reason that Jansen was condemned. Ultimately, Pope Innocent X condemned the Augustinus in 1642 and placed it on his Index of Forbidden Books. Despite its papal condemnation, Jansen was continually defended by his lifelong friend, John de Vorgier de Horan, who was then the abbot of St. Cyran, as well as the nuns of the celebrated Cistercian convent of Port Royal des Champs, as well as by Antoine Arnauld, Pasquier Quesnay, who organized a Jansenist political party in Parliament. Blaise Pascal and Jean Racine were also noted cultural forces who were also Jansenists. You can see a little timeline here of Jansenism's continued spread. It was condemned again in 1705 after a book was published titled The New Testament in French with Moral Reflections on Each Verse. This caused Jansenist soteriology to grow rampantly throughout France. And after this, Pope Clement XI issued a papal bull condemning Jansenism once again and renewing prior condemnations of it. It also began a process of censoring the nuns of Port Royal. They were forbidden from accepting new members from 1705 to 1709, and ultimately all of these heretical nuns were evicted from their convent in 1709. Now, Louis XIV, who would end up kind of starting Gallicanism, which would end up allying with Jansenism, actually accepted the condemnation of Jansenism. He wasn't in favor of it himself. But the eviction of these nuns gained the support of the populace, who pitied these old, frail nuns that were kicked out of their convent for what they didn't really understand to be a very dangerous heresy. They just saw it as an obscure interpretation of Catholicism, perhaps. Port Royal ended up becoming a pilgrimage site amongst Jansenists, and a lot of lay people who were otherwise good Catholics ended up getting swept away with this pity party for these heretics, and then ended up ultimately joining this heretical movement. Louis XIV responded by demolishing the convent and removing the deceased nuns from the ground in which they were buried and moving them to common graves, but these actions were seen as further persecution of the sect and led to their further support. This also is what helped cause Jansenism to develop into a political party which sought to end the absolutist monarchy because, of course, they were being persecuted by the absolutist monarch. And so the Jansenist political party would help advocate throughout the 18th century for a separation between church and state, or for a more secular government that would not interfere with religious liberty. However, Jansenism would not have ultimately have found institutional success if it did not emerge alongside the Gallican theory of ecclesiology, which itself was dependent on absolutist political theories. So what do we know about absolutist monarchies? Absolutist monarchies, largely prevalent in Europe from the 16th to the 18th centuries, were first of all underpinned by the political theory of divine rights, but this once again did not really develop until the 1500s. So the idea that, we have these hereditary dynasties throughout Europe at this time, and so the theory goes that, if I was born to be next in line to be king, that's because God chose me or fashioned me to be king, therefore I ought to rule the nation absolutely and be totally in charge of all of the state's institutions, political, economic, and religious. This was not the theory of royal legitimacy before the 1500s. The secular power was not seen as being divinely established as much as the religious power that clearly was divinely established by our Lord when he established the papacy and the episcopacy and the 12 apostles. So as monarchs began to draw more and more centralized power to themselves, they began to enact sweeping practical reforms, often aimed at strengthening the entire state through strong centralization. They especially focused on developing coherent economic plans for the entire state, centralizing legal codes for the entire nation, and establishing standing armies so that the kings would no longer need to rely on the support of local nobility to raise defense for the state. The centralization of legal codes led many jurists to study ancient Roman law because the law code of Justinian was seen as the perfect actualization of secular law. But as these historians began to try to dig deeper and deeper and deeper to figure out what was exactly the exact law code of Justinian before later accretions were added to it, this helped develop Enlightenment historiography, which was very critical of the received tradition and sought to cut beyond it by critically examining texts to try to find what details maybe were invented or fabricated. Absolutism could be said to be the death blow to the medieval period. Earlier systems of government featured decentralized feudalism, in which a central monarch relied on support from regional nobility in order for them to govern the state. Power was scattered amongst autonomous local lords who governed their regions consistently with the customs and traditions of the society in which they lived. Medieval monarchs were even at times referred to as first among equals of the nobility in those medieval states in which monarchs were chosen not through hereditary inheritance, but by the election of the nobility. Absolutist monarchies, on the other hand, subverted the political principles of traditional Catholic Christendom by asserting that the monarch had supreme authority over every institution in his state, including the church within their territories. This directly undermined the Pope's universal authority over the church and relitigated the controversies over control of the church of the investiture crises of the earlier medieval period, like the beginning of the second millennium. Key absolutist monarchs include King Louis XIV of France, and you can see the years they reigned here. He's the first truly absolutist king who constructed Versailles. He basically governed with the theories developed by his father, Louis XIII, but he was able to actualize them more than his father was. Peter the Great of Russia embarked on extensive westernization reforms in Russia. He actually subjected the entire Russian Orthodox Church to himself and abolished the patriarch because he didn't want to have to compete for control of the Church of Russia. Frederick the Great of Prussia was an enlightened absolutist who modernized Prussian bureaucracy and military according to Enlightenment ideals. Maria Theresa of Austria, or the Holy Roman Empire, as well as her son Joseph II, who co-reigned alongside her for 15 years and then reigned the empire himself for 10 years, implemented significant administrative, military, and educational reforms. He and his mother regulated mandatory public education for youths in order to increase literacy in the HRE, emphasized vernacular in education, taught practical schools, and also nationalized the seminaries, putting them under his direct control. Now, while most identify France's King Louis XIII, who reigned from 1610 to 1643, as the first to formulate the theories of political absolutism, his son Louis XIV was the first European monarch, again, to put these theories directly into practice. He famously proclaimed, "I am the state." However, it should be noted that Henry VIII of England, who reigned about a century before Louis XIII, was of course the first to clearly formulate the theories of the secular power having supreme authority over the church in his state in the 16th century. Once again, this was an age-old struggle, even in the Byzantine period, between who had control over the church, the secular power or the spiritual power. However, this issue was settled at the end of the investiture controversies, and it was Henry VIII who first relitigated these controversies and actually took complete control over the Church of England, calling himself the defender of the Church of England and the head of the Church of England, and requiring all nobility to swear an oath of fealty to him as the head of the Church of England. He, of course, brutally tortured and killed any nobility that refused to acknowledge him as the head of the Church of England, including St. Thomas Becket. In college, I wrote a paper titled "How the West Invaded the West," and the purpose of this paper was to talk about how it was this absolutist style of government that first took over traditional medieval Christendom before that modern bureaucratic style of government began to take over the traditions of foreign nations. If you've ever watched The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, you know that Japanese historiography often bemoans the manner in which the Meiji Restoration, which this movie is about, saw modern Western institutions come in and override centuries of Japanese tradition. And there's a very sad tone to this movie as that's taking place. But we don't only need to feel bad for the loss of the, frankly, kind of demonic Japanese institutions. The institutional glorying in suicide is, in fact, demonic. But we can also realize that before Western institutions infiltrated and overran traditions in Japan, they did the same thing in the West. This Western washing of societies, which continues to take place in the world up to the present day, all throughout the world, where traditional customs are replaced by Western ones, this first happened in the West. Absolutist monarchs overrid centuries of tradition and replaced them with the all-powerful reign of the state. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the complete destruction of traditional medieval institutions, replaced by the machine-like institutions that ran these political bodies not through customs, traditions, or regional distribution of power, but by central state-run bureaucracies. There was an attempt to submit all elements of the society to the state, which in this period was a monarch, but the same process can happen with democracies, which would coordinate between all of the moving pieces of society to make them as efficient as possible. And the attempt to subjugate all things to the state continues to this day, even in the modern Western states, where things as intimate as your healthcare decisions, and I'm not talking about the abortion, I'm talking about like if your son is on life support, the state in a lot of the states in Canada, or the state in Great Britain, they get to decide when you pull the plug rather than you. Even if you would like to continue funding it, because you can't fund it because it's all state run, or things like whether or not you can raise your kids if they decide they want to have a different gender identity. There are many states in the United States where you can lose custody of your child if they want to, quote unquote, change their gender, and you do not approve of that lunacy. So anyways, there's still to this day an ongoing attempt to submit more and more elements of society to the state, and that began with the absolutists' revolution in the 17th century. Here are examples of how the absolutist monarchies centralized the institutions of their state. Please feel free to pause and take a read of that if you'd like to. But this modern attitude, which was willing to spur tradition and customs in favor of rationalistic, more efficient means of governance, emerged from the attitude which was inclined towards skepticism and rationality, and these attitudes would explode in the 18th century in the atheistic Enlightenment. Absolutism both emerged from a common way of thinking, as the Enlightenment had, and further contributed to the Enlightenment. When religion became subjected to the state under the absolutist monarchs such as King Louis XIV, timeless truths began to be perceived as arbitrary matters of human legislation. We could say that the same thing even occurred in ancient Rome. Once the Senate began to frivolously appoint favored emperors as deities through a simple secular legislative process, faith in the old Roman gods waned in late imperial Rome, helping to prime that civilization for a embrace of Christianity. The enlightened absolutists of the 18th century, from Frederick the Great of Prussia to Catherine the Great of Russia, to Joseph II of Austria, who co-reigned again with his mother, to Charles III of Spain, and even really Napoleon Bonaparte, who was an enlightened despot, integrated absolutist political theories in which all things in society should be subjected to the state with the ideas of the Enlightenment, the political and economic and psychological, well, not really psychological yet, but historical and religious ideas of the Enlightenment. Absolutist theories of government, that all things should be subjected to the king and there is no limits to what the king or the state is in charge of, will lead to nationalized Catholicism, because we will start to believe in these societies that even the churches of a particular nation are subject to the jurisdiction of the secular king. Gallicanism was either influenced by or born of the same political theories of religious absolutism that I just mentioned that gave us Anglicanism in England, though Gallicans sought to maintain some association with the papacy in order to not simply unwind entirely into Protestantism. Gallicans believed that while the Pope had some unclear amount of authority over the universal church, this was, as the Orthodox say, the authority of one who was a first among equals, with the secular powers and nationalist customs counting amongst the equals which the Pope had to contend with in making decisions regarding the universal church. Once you start to believe that the Pope is a first among equals, doctrinal relativism is sure to follow, because if you have disagreement amongst all these equals, the King of France, the customs of the Jansenist people in France, or this bishop or that bishop or that bishop, if they all have different agreements and there's no way to settle it, then ultimately we're going to have doctrinal relativism, which will end up eroding faith in Christian dogma in general. Other nationalist ecclesiastical theories emerged alongside absolutist political regimes. There wasn't only the Anglicans and the Gallicans who sought to do so. Aristianism was the political theories developed by the Protestant Erastus, who was a Calvinist who believed that the secular state should punish people for all sins, not the church. So he believed in the absolutist Protestant state. Regalism was the nationalist political movement in Spain, which sought to give the crown of Spain control over the church. Febronianism was the German equivalent of Gallicanism that was prominent in both Prussia and the Holy Roman Empire. And Josephinism was, it's another term for Febronianism, especially the radical Enlightenment-inspired reforms to the church that Joseph II sought to integrate into the church of the HRE during his unhappy reign. I want to provide this resource to you here. You can pause and read it. This is a timeline of how French Gallicanism emerged, particularly in France. But once again, this movement to nationalize Catholicism, this was happening all throughout Europe, right alongside absolutist monarchies, which were seeking to subject all institutions to the state. But you can see the spread of the Gallican schismatic heresy here in this slide from the late 16th century, just after the Council of Trent, all the way until the late 17th century. Gallicanism would end up, amazingly, merging with Jansenism. And I say this is amazing because originally King Louis XIV was persecuting Jansenism. He saw it as a dissident heresy. He agreed with the Pope about that. Jansenism represented a divergence from Catholic tradition that was native to France. Although Jansen himself was Dutch, the movement grew in popularity mainly around the monastery of Saint Cyran, as well as the convent of Port Royal des Champs. Further, the Jansenist political party would become an important counterweight to the absolutist monarchy in the 18th century, causing the Jansenist heresy to grow in popularity during the Enlightenment movement, which also sought to limit the authority of the absolutist monarch. Although Gallicanism was born of absolutism, the Gallican ecclesiastical heresy ultimately allied itself with the Jansenist soteriological and anthropological heresy because the two were allied in desiring independence from Rome and in the ecclesial enshrinement of Frenchness. Jansenism was, in fact, a condemned heresy. The teachings of Baius and the teachings of Cornelius Jansen had been condemned by the Vatican for well over a century by the time the 18th century began. However, unlike Protestantism, which protested Catholicism and wanted to present itself as being very different in its rituals and in its form of prayer from Catholicism, Jansenism wanted to present itself as Catholic because it held many of the same liturgical beliefs as the Catholic Church and because it had the same sacramental system as the Catholic Church. And so Jansenism never ceased to have valid holy orders because when bishops ordained other Jansenist clerics, or when a Gallican as well would ordain other bishops, they were intending to pass on valid holy orders, and so they did pass on valid holy orders, even though their heresies made the transmission of these sacraments illicit. We could see here a list of all of the condemnations of Jansenism here, so we can see that it is, in fact, a condemned heresy. But the Gallicans in France favored a sort of unofficial merger with Jansenism, or at least a very close association or communion with Jansenism, because this was a way to basically resist Roman authority. Because if the popes had said Jansenism was a heresy, the Gallicans would say, well, you don't have the authority to say that. You don't have the authority over the French church. The king does, and the bishops of France do, and therefore we're going to say it's not a heresy. And so this causes Jansenists and Gallicans to merge more and more together. Jansenists, of course, would prefer to be Gallicans, or Jansenists would prefer for the universal church to have a Gallican nature, or a nationalist nature, because this would mean that all these papal condemnations would have no authority over them. And so Jansenists are more inclined towards Gallicanism as an ecclesiastical structure, and Gallicans were inclined towards having favorable relationships with Jansenists, because this was a way to revolt against Roman authority. Amazingly, this nationalist Catholic, or Catholic-ish movement, which had utterly ravaged the Church of England, and had nearly consumed the French Church as well, was making inroads in the Low Countries, in the Spanish Empire, and in the Holy Roman Empire during Joseph II's reign. But in the late 18th century, this nationalized vision for Catholicism, which was very influenced by the Enlightenment, and at times was very influenced by Jansenism as well, even began to spread in northern Italy. In 1786, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and Bishop Scipione de Ricci convened the Synod of Pistoia in order to propose a big list of reforms to the Church of Pistoia. The purpose of this synod was to institute the reforms of their nationalistic heresy in northern Italy, establishing the ecclesiastical heresy even in the backyard of the Pope himself. In this synod, we see the manner in which Gallicanism had become influenced by the secular Enlightenment. Untethered from the watchful eye of the papacy, the Gallican-Jansenist theologians, bishops, and priests had become very influenced by the secular, materialistic, philosophical movement which had demolished the legitimacy of the reign of sacred theology as the queen of the disciplines, replacing it with naturalism and empiricism and materialism instead. As a result of the materialistic intellectual influence that Gallicanism and Jansenism had absorbed, many Gallicans or Jansenists began to perceive the purpose of the liturgy as to make people better, since this was the only empirically verified outcome of the sacred rites, or at least that's an argument made by Alcuin Reid in his Organic Development of the Liturgy. This was far different from the traditional Catholic understanding that the liturgy existed to worship and offer fitting sacrifice to God. I have these slides here as just a resource for you if you want to see how Gallicanism/Jansenism began to merge with the secular Enlightenment. So, the same thinkers who are often associated with the schismatic nationalistic heresies, or the theories of ecclesiology, are sometimes referred to as the Catholic Enlightenment. These Catholic theologians and philosophers engaged with the Enlightenment ideas, and they often adopted critical judgment and a focus on reason in their interpretation of sacred tradition. In other words, they were willing to accept materialistic premises and use materialistic methods to shed doubt on the received Catholic tradition. The following thinkers were either Gallicans or Jansenists who were also considered participants in the Enlightenment philosophical movement, showing us that there was a lot of exchange of ideas between the Gallican or Jansenist movement and the secular Enlightenment. I think further study is needed to determine to what degree Gallicanism or Jansenism might have even caused the Enlightenment. Many, such as Jonathan Israel in The Radical Enlightenment, Philosophy and the Making of Modernity, have already pointed out the relationship between the Protestant deformation and the Enlightenment. Since Protestantism caused widespread doubt in the intellectual religious tradition of Western civilization, and especially in Catholicism, he argues, and many historians have argued, that the Protestant Reformation was the first major rupture with the received religious tradition of Christendom that would end up flowering in the atheistic Enlightenment, which would reject belief in God or any spiritual realities in general. However, since it was although it was a pan-European movement, the Enlightenment was mainly centered in France, and its most devastating effects spread out throughout the entire continent from France after the French Revolution and the conquest of Napoleon Bonaparte. So, is it possible, then, that the French Enlightenment emerged, in part at least, due to the search of the Jansenists and the Gallicans for a critical historical review of theological, ecclesial, and patristic literature to further the doubt they wanted to advance on the received Catholic historical tradition, especially the received Catholic tradition regarding ecclesiology and papal supremacy? I'm inclined, along with many others, to see the beginning of the Enlightenment with the first philosophy of René Descartes, whose search for an epistemology which could not be denied whatsoever kind of begins the process of radical doubt in the assumptions that Western civilization was built upon, namely the assumptions of Catholic tradition. Although René Descartes did not doubt these dogmas of Catholicism, he was a faithful Catholic till his death, and even converted the Protestant Queen of Sweden. Regardless, by the late 18th century, the enemies of the Catholic tradition found themselves in an alliance. Jansenists, Gallicans, Regalists, Febroniists were all, of course, intellectual allies because they all believed that the Church should be subjected to the secular state rather than the Pope. They shared their ideas with one another. The transmission of ideas made the Gallican movement, as articulated by the Synod of Pistoia, reflect the Enlightenment's scorn for any traditions that could not be justified using the minimalist or reductionist rationalism, as well as a general de-emphasis on spirituality, which was the trademark of the Enlightenment, and a de-emphasis on mystery in favor of things which had direct, material, observable effects. Thus, the Gallican liturgy of the Synod of Pistoia could be called the Enlightenment Mass. This is a Jansenist chapel, and you can see it's just very simple, very bare. There's very little sacred art. There's only one altar. There's no side altars. Oh, there's a side altar right there, so I take that back. Generally, Jansenist chapels did not have side altars because they wanted all the attention to be on the one altar, and they wanted the church to be very bare. The Gallican liturgy sought to shave away the rich complexities of Catholic tradition in order to emphasize the bare essentials that those liturgical actions were supposed to accomplish, at least what the Gallican thinkers believed those liturgical actions were supposed to accomplish. This is different from Catholic tradition, which did not have a minimalist attitude toward the liturgy, but tended to want to adorn the liturgy with as much beauty as possible out of a pious desire to please God with extravagance as he loves us with extravagance. The Gallicans sought also to minimize outward ceremonies and shorten or omit lengthy prayers, which were deemed by them to be superfluous or distracting from the liturgy's essential purpose, according to them, what they thought the liturgy's essential purpose was. Catholic tradition sought to carefully craft prayers, by contrast, to make sure that the prayer both gave God as much honor as possible, as well as sufficiently asked for his intercession as comprehensively as possible. The liturgy traditionally emphasized a sense of mystery, using repetitions to help key doctrines sink in during the prayers, and by veiling the most sacred elements of the Mass in order to shroud them in mystery. The use of the Latin language is in fact a veil over the prayers. In order to protect their sanctity, they are veiled with the mystery of Latin. The whispered prayers of the words of consecration are a further veil over those prayers, and the ad orientem prayer posture is also a veil over the sacredness of the Eucharistic consecration. The Gallican liturgists sought to define the liturgy's central purpose, at least according to Alcuin Reid, in terms of that which could be empirically verified to make people better, while traditionally, by contrast, Catholicism understood the liturgy to be a perfect propitiatory sacrifice. This argument of Alcuin Reid's that the Gallicans believed the liturgy existed to make people better, that could be contested. There is also evidence that both Jansenists and generic Gallicans did believe that the Mass was a propitiatory sacrifice. This was a major bone of contention between Protestants and Catholics since the Reformation. And so, likely, if Gallicans and Jansenists wanted to present themselves as Catholics, they wouldn't have denied that the Mass was a propitiatory sacrifice. So that is a opinion that Alcuin Reid holds, which could be contested. The Synod of Pistoia promulgated the following decrees. The liturgy should be in vernacular. There should be a Gallicanist ecclesiology ruling the church, and there should be religious liberty in all states. While the papacy did not immediately respond to these controversial decrees after the French Revolution of 1789 and then the Reign of Terror in 1793, Pope Pius VI issued his papal bull in 1794, which systematically condemned 85 of the principles of the Synod of Pistoia as being incompatible with the Catholic faith. One issue that he took with the Synod of Pistoia was its treatment of the Eucharist, which refrained from explicitly using the term transubstantiation. He believed that the omission of this term was suspect of heresy. It's noteworthy that the Second Vatican Council's treatment of the Eucharist in Sacrosanctum Concilium also refrained from using the term transubstantiation. I have a link here to Sean Blanchard's chapter on the Synod's treatment of the Eucharist, and I'll just show you the link. You can go check it out. In this chapter, Blanchard highlighted similarities between the ideas of the Synod of Pistoia and the themes of Vatican II. After we take a look at this, we'll take a look at the condemnation of the Synod of Pistoia by Pope Pius VI. But we should preface looking at the similarities between the Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, and then our look at how Pope Pius VI condemned the Synod of Pistoia, by understanding that the Church can, of course, validly condemn the Synod of Pistoia for its overall schismatic ecclesiology, even while eventually, 2 centuries later, the Church would acknowledge some of the non-heretical ideas in the Synod of Pistoia as being appropriate for the Church to implement. So you can condemn the Synod for its issues, but also adopt certain measures from the Synod after the space of 2 centuries, Pope Pius VI did in fact state that the Synod of Pistoia used a lot of Catholic language to cover over its heresies, so this Catholic language certainly could be commended. So if you want to check out the link here, this is published by the Church Life Journal from Notre Dame University. You could probably just type in the title of the article here. But basically this overviews the full historical context of the Synod of Pistoia, and also the similarities between the Synod of Pistoia and the decrees in Vatican II. So it's worth checking out if you want to read further. Let's consider some highlights from Pope Pius VI, not 7th, excuse me, his Auctorem Fidei. It begins with essentially a declaration of war on the Enlightenment and its Gallican ecclesiastical allies, which would dominate the papal magisteriums of the entire long 19th century, which goes from Auctorem Fidei all the way until the death of Pope Pius X. He begins the papal bull by saying, "Truly in these tumultuous times, in this revolutionary upheaval, all good men must join the burdensome struggle against any and all enemies of the Christian name. Indeed, in these hardships that surround us on every side, a heap of other troubles have mounted up, as it were, so that what should have been for us a source of joy is the source of a greater sadness. For in fact, when a leader of God's holy church, under the name of priest, turns the very people of Christ away from the path of truth, toward the peril of an erroneous belief, and when this occurs in a major city," he's talking about Pistoia, "then clearly the distress is multiplied and a greater anxiety is in order. To be sure, this has not occurred in far-off lands, but in the full blaze of Italy, under the eyes of the city, and near the threshold of the apostles, that is, the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul." And here he talks about the particular bishop who convened the Synod of Pistoia. He talks about how he wanted to call him to discuss these matters privately, but he would not come, and that's why he then moved forward with publishing the papal bull. Pope Pius VI condemns the use of what one might call weaponized ambiguity in the Synod of Pistoia. He says, "In order not to shock the ears of Catholics, the innovators sought to hide their tortuous maneuvers by seemingly innocuous words, such as would allow them to insinuate error into the souls in the subtlest manner. Once the truth had been compromised, they could, by means of slight changes or additions in phraseology, distort the confession of the faith necessary for our salvation, and lead the faithful by gradual errors to their eternal damnation. Regardless of the circumstances under which it is used, this manner of dissimulating and lying is vicious. It can never be tolerated in a synod, for the reason that a synod's principal glory consists, above all, in teaching the truth with clarity and excluding all danger of error." Pope Pius VI then proceeded to condemn, Blanchard numbered it at 85, and so he's probably right, because he studied this much more extensively than I have. There are 98 like little points of issues with the Synod of Pistoia that I'm going to show you, so that's why I have this number here. But maybe some of them were just repeating the same condemnation, and I think we could probably trust his peer-reviewed numbering of 85 condemnations. I'm going to show you guys a link of a comprehensive list of the condemnations of Auctorem Fidei, so all the issues that Pope Pius VI had with the Synod of Pistoia. But I have highlighted the condemnations that explicitly pertain to the liturgy. If you would like to access this document, if you become a member of the channel and join the Scholarium, you can personally comment to ask me for any resources you want to share. Just give me your email and I'll share with you any resources you've seen on the channel. So, if you want, you can pause though and read any one of these, but it's kind of an annoying way to read it. So here we go. The partaking of the victim in the sacrifice of the Mass. So let's read this here. Okay, so these are all elements of Pistoia that regarded the Eucharist or the Mass that Pope Pius VI is condemning. Let's take a look at what the liturgy looked like for the Gallicans in Pistoia, in order to see, was their version of the Mass, in fact, an old Novus Ordo? So he condemns the proposition of the Synod in which, after it states that a partaking of the victim is an essential part of the sacrifice, it adds, nevertheless, it does not condemn as illicit those Masses in which those present do not communicate sacramentally, for the reason that they do partake of the victim, although less perfectly, by receiving it spiritually. This insinuates there is something lacking to the essence of the sacrifice in that sacrifice which is performed either with no one present, or with those present who partake of the victim neither sacramentally nor spiritually, and as if those Masses should be condemned as illicit, which, with the priest alone communicating, no one is present who communicates either sacramentally or spiritually. So who's calling that either false, erroneous, or suspected of heresy, or savoring of it. So he's not calling it explicitly heretical, but this is what he's deeming this teaching to be. Regarding the efficacy of the rite of consecration, the doctrine of the Synod, in that part in which, undertaking to explain the doctrine of faith in the rite of consecration, and disregarding the scholastic questions about the manner in which Christ is in the Eucharist, from which questions it exhorts priests performing the duty of teaching to refrain, it states the doctrine in these two propositions only. 1. After the consecration, Christ is truly released substantially under the species. And 2. Then the whole substance of the bread and wine ceases, appearances only remaining. It doctrines absolutely omits to make any mention of transubstantiation, or conversion of the whole substance of the bread into the body, and of the whole substance of the wine into the blood, which the Council of Trent defined as a dogma. So it's basically avoiding the use of the word transubstantiation is dangerous, derogatory to the exposition of Catholic truth, and favorable to heretics. The application of the fruit of the sacrifice. So he condemns the Synod of Pistoia's professing that to believe that the oblation of the sacrifice extends itself to all in such a way, however, that in the liturgy there can be made a special commemoration of certain individuals, both living and dead, by praying God specially for them. Not, however, that we should believe that it is the will of the priest to apply the fruit of the sacrifice to whom he wishes. Rather, we condemn this error as greatly offending the rights of God, who alone distributes the fruit of the sacrifice to whom he wishes, according to that measure which pleases him. So the Jansenists / Gallicans here condemn the idea that you can offer Mass for somebody. Point 1531. Pius VI condemns the proposition, enunciating that it is fitting, in accordance with the order of divine services and ancient custom, that there be only one altar in each temple, and therefore that it is pleased to restore that custom of having only one altar per church. And so he condemns this as being derogatory towards church tradition. He also condemns the prescription which forbids relics or flowers to be placed upon the altar. And he condemns the Synod's calling that the liturgy return to a greater simplicity of rites by expressing it in the vernacular language, by uttering it in a loud voice. So these are all ideas which would eventually be taken up by Vatican II, and these ideas were condemned in this document in the late 18th century. Excuse me. Let's scroll down to a few other condemnations that regard the liturgy. So there was some talk in the synods to simply skip right to the diaconate and skip over the minor orders. That idea was condemned. The Synod of Pistoia condemned the idea that you could have a mass intention by making a donation, and so the Pope was condemning that condemnation. The Pope also condemned civic marriages, which was a very pro-absolutist political idea that marriage should be regulated by the state rather than be deemed purely as a sacrament of the Church. The Jansenists had condemned devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and they said you cannot worship a part of Jesus' body, you can only worship the totality. And the Church has always been in favor of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or the precious blood for that matter. The Gallicans condemned the superstitious, sort of vain repetitions, and the Pope is condemning that, saying that repetitions can in fact be a meritorious way to pray. And the Pope condemns the Synod's proposition that it would be against apostolic practice and the plans of God unless there were a way prepared for the people to unite their voice with that of the whole Church. He's condemning the use of the vernacular in the Church's official prayers. He also condemns the Synod's prescription, which discriminated against the images of the incomprehensible Trinity and wanted them to be removed from the Church. It's basically modern iconoclasm, and the Pope is condemning that here. Gallicanism also sought to institute new feasts that derived their origin from neglect and observance of older feasts. The Gallicans wanted to basically drastically minimize the sacral calendar of feast days, and the Pope is condemning that notion. The Pope is also condemning the notion that feast days could be transferred to the nearest Sunday, and that is in fact now allowed in the Universal Church. So, for example, the Feast of the Ascension was traditionally 40 days after Easter, but in the United States, that is transferred to the nearest Sunday. So the sixth Sunday of Easter becomes the Ascension in the United States. So the idea of transferring feasts to the nearest Sunday, that was condemned by the Pope. All right, I think that's it here for condemnations that regarded the liturgy. So ask yourself, of all the Gallican ideas that the Pope condemned here, did it seem like he was condemning a depiction of the Novus Ordo Mass? There may have been some similarities. There may have been some similarities between like a simplified rite and maybe like less sacred art. But in totality, we did not just see a glimpse of the Novus Ordo Mass. So I begin this video here with a pretty cool looking thumbnail, the Novus Ordo was first invented by Jansenists. Well, that's a thing that it does float around in traditional circles. It seems to be implied by Alcuin Reid in the Organic Development of the Liturgy that what we're seeing with this Gallican Mass of the 19th century is a sort of precursor to the Novus Ordo. Don't know if that's exactly what he's implying. It seemed to be the implication when I read through his texts. And there are commonalities between the Novus Ordo and the Gallican liturgy we read about in Pistoia and in other in other 19th century sources. So both liturgies promoted a primitive or archaeologist liturgy, which was perhaps more pure. If you think of the older liturgy as being more pure, then both promoted a more pure older liturgy. That's true. Both promoted vernacular missals. However, in the Gallican liturgy, it was recommended that laity read along in a vernacular missal. In the Novus Ordo, the entire Mass is in the vernacular. Both also had a sort of a preference for minimalist church decorations, because both emphasized interior piety rather than external art. Both would also emphasize simpler vestments and restrained music. Now, the Gallican liturgy favored plain chant or simpler hymns that were less emotional and less grand or epic than the grand polyphonic or orchestral compositions that were popular during this time period. The Novus Ordo, of course, is going to favor more simple music, but it's going to favor more like folk music, music that emerges from a culture using instruments that are popular in that culture and not tying the liturgy down with traditional styles of music. There are also, of course, ways that the Gallican or Jansenist liturgy was not like the Novus Ordo. We should not merely dismiss the historical data which suggests that the Gallican liturgy was distinct from the Novus Ordo. So, the Jansenists advocated typically for infrequent communion, or at least in practice, did practice gravely infrequent communion. And this was a thing throughout all of Catholic tradition, that many people were too afraid to go receive communion, but the Jansenists especially believed that the conditions for receiving communion were so extreme that many people didn't very often at all. Jansenists also believed in rigorous conditions for absolution. Their severe moral theology made sacramental absolution impossible without perfect contrition, and so many people never went to confession. And also in the Novus Ordo, some people didn't go to confession very often, but this was not because it was believed that they didn't have perfect contrition. It was because they didn't believe confession was necessary. They weren't really concerned with sin. There was a big emphasis on unworthiness. The liturgical approach of the Jansenists highly emphasized penitential practices, which the Novus Ordo certainly did not. And the austerity in the Jansenist liturgy was born of that as well. Their emphasis on spiritual rigor led for a preference for more austere and less ornate liturgical celebrations. They believed that elaborate vestments were too pleasing to the eyes, and they wanted to do penance from them. And the same was true of Jansenist styles of music and decorations in general. The Gallican-Jansenist liturgy attempted to strip down the traditional Latin Mass of its grandeur, because they perceived this received liturgical tradition as too excessive and too enjoyable. They wanted the Mass to be penitential, and they also thought that these ceremonies and grandeurs and grandiose elements distracted the laity from the essential purpose of the Mass. But what did they perceive the essential purpose to be? As I mentioned, Reid says the Jansenists believed the liturgy existed to make people better. However, evidence does exist that most Gallicans and Jansenists believed that the Mass was in fact a propitiatory sacrifice. The Neo-Gallican Mass of the 19th century, you could say Neo-Gallican to distinguish it from the Gallican Rite of the first millennium, highly emphasized interior piety, which is a good thing, but wrongly believed that exterior piety impeded rather than aided the fostering of interior piety. And once again, many of the Gallican liturgists pursued an archaeologist return to a simpler and more pure ancient liturgy. Now, Novus Ordo liturgists would also attempt to strip the TLM of many of its quote-unquote historical accretions in favor of a more simple and perhaps purer ancient rite. Many of the liturgical movement scholars also had a negative attitude toward the excessive adornments for the liturgy and attempted to simplify it. However, there was no attempt in the Novus Ordo to abolish weekday masses or to be more reserved with the reception of Holy Communion. In fact, there was a more developed weekday liturgy developed in the Novus Ordo even than the traditional Latin Mass. There was a weekday lectionary which was instituted in the Novus Ordo, while in the Latin Mass, you would just basically celebrate the weekday Masses as like the Wednesday after the third week of Ordinary Time, or it would be a votive Mass if there wasn't a feast occurring on that day to some saint. Penance was de-emphasized again in the Novus Ordo, but not because it was deemed too difficult to receive absolution, but because it was deemed unnecessary, because many progressive Catholics didn't really think we needed to be that worried with sin. Now, the Novus Ordo did seek not only to strip the traditional Latin Mass of any of its element and leave it bare, but actually to embellish the liturgy with new ceremonies and adornments. It sought to create new adornments whole cloth from the discernment of the national bishops' conferences about how enculturated practices which emerged from the popular piety of a particular group of people, especially their favorite liturgical hymns, could be integrated into their practice of the Mass. So the Jansenist liturgy is attempted to strip down the TLM to make it stripped and bare and penitential and, frankly, cold. The Novus Ordo does not attempt to be cold, even if it does end up that way in many of the practices of the Novus Ordo. It might end up being cold compared to the traditional Latin Mass. But the aim of the liturgical movement scholars was to remove the canonized or codified adornments to the traditional Latin liturgy so that there would be room and the flexibility to implement new adornments which emerged naturally from the cultures of particular national churches, rather than simply have these codified adornments to the liturgy which emerged from medieval Christian society. Problems, of course, emerge when these opened doors to liturgical enculturation were opened so wide and without enough regulation to the point where heretical innovations could easily sneak into the celebration of the Mass. Ironically, and you get things like this, whatever in the world is going on here. The Novus Ordo, then, is a flexible skeleton of a liturgy, which was made so in order to allow natural enculturation to occur in a manner similar to the way in which distinctive national rites emerged from the more open-ended liturgies of the first few centuries. Because Catholicism had become, and not only Catholicism, but the Latin Rite liturgy had become the liturgy of most of the nations on planet Earth, some of the thinking behind the Novus Ordo was to minimize the adornments to the essential elements of the Mass so that new adornments could validly be implemented into the practice of the Mass over time, which were emerging naturally from the various cultures of the globe's people. And you could be critical of that approach, but that was the approach of the reformers of the Mass. And of course, as I mentioned already, problems emerge when the doors for enculturation are opened so wide that heretical innovations can creep into the Mass. It's been ironic that when pious Catholic congregations implement more faithful adornments to the Mass, typically the adornments that faithful parishes, which are not embracing any heresies whatsoever, they typically use the flexibility of the Novus Ordo to integrate their popular piety into the liturgy and simply make it more like the traditional Latin Mass. So, for example, a lot of Novus Ordo parishes have reinstituted altar rails. That's using the flexibility of the Novus Ordo to implement something that emerges genuinely from their popular piety, and they're asking for a return to tradition. Receiving on the tongue is, of course, still the favored reception of communion in the Roman Rite, but that's becoming more common in these traditional parishes as well. Implementing Latin and Greek prayers when appropriate is emerging as a valid exercise of the flexibility of the Novus Ordo in response to popular piety. And a very interesting one that's taken hold, at least in my area, is in pretty much any church you go to now, the people pray the St. Michael prayer after Mass. And so that's an element of popular piety which has adorned the Novus Ordo liturgy naturally because of its flexibility. And once again, the St. Michael prayer after Mass, that was a part of the traditional Latin Mass since the reign of Pope Leo XIII. So it's another return to tradition that's being reintegrated into the Novus Ordo naturally as a result of the popular piety of the faithful Catholics celebrating the Novus Ordo. But once again, less pious Catholic congregations, led by rebellious Enlightenment-inspired progressive priests, would do their best to adapt the flexible Novus Ordo liturgy in manners which were consistent with their heresies, and the lenient style of governance of the post-conciliar church would typically allow these heresies and liturgically heretical innovations to ravage parishes throughout the world for far too long, to the destruction of many people's faith. So, what's our plan moving forward here? Well, in this video, we learned a whole history of Jansenism and Gallicanism and nationalist Catholicism. We basically reached the conclusion that while the Jansenist liturgy of the 19th century was in part inspired by the Enlightenment, and therefore it has a lot of things in common with the Novus Ordo, I do not think it would be appropriate to say that the Gallican liturgy was a precursor to the Novus Ordo. Now, hope you're not disappointed by that conclusion. Maybe you disagree. Please comment below if you do. Where are we going from here? So I have a whole podcast series on the Enlightenment. I'm not going to post a particular video about the Catholic response to the Enlightenment because I already have done that. I invite you to go to the channel and look for the video titled, or you can go to just YouTube, search the Catholic response to the Enlightenment, Historia Ecclesiastica, and that would kind of be a good video to watch after this if you're not familiar with how the popes responded to the Enlightenment throughout the 19th century. We're going to pick it up again in the next video, looking at the liturgical movement from the very late 19th century all the way until Vatican II. So we'll look at how the liturgical movement ends up developing a vision for a reformed Mass, what their goals were, why they thought they were necessary, and also what political strategies they used to get their radical ideas eventually, reaching the desk of Pope Pius XII and receiving his serious consideration. After that, we're going to do a whole study on the life of Annibale Bugnini and how he was able to basically get the liturgical movement across the finish line. And we'll look at Vatican II after that. We'll look at the concilium that Bugnini led after that, looking at how particularly each change of the Novus Ordo was politically maneuvered during the 1960s. The series will finish with a look at the effects of the Novus Ordo after its promulgation in 1969. Let us pray. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Gloria Patri, et Filio, et Spiritui Sancto. Sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Thank you so much for watching this video to its conclusion. Please leave a thoughtful comment below, and may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your mind anything I've said unfaithful to him or untrue. God bless you. See you next time. Bye.